Hello and welcome to Clydebridge Station. This is the second video in my series of 6 looking at the business sectors of BR in detail in the 1980s. And it'll be focusing on the rail freight sector. But just before I get underway, there has been a complaint made about the layout. It's full of 47s and someone suggested that it needed a steam engine. They actually referred to it as needing a kettle. So you'll be pleased to hear I've went and got a kettle. And now on with the programme. Although we associate railways these days with the movement of vast numbers of people from one point to another, it's easy to forget that in the early days the main purpose of rail was to move vast amounts of freight from point to point. In fact, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which operated from 1825 to 1863 as a company, was originally opened to move coal from various collieries, and it was only within a couple of years that they actually realised that the movement of passengers could be an interesting side business. Over the years, various freight companies, rail companies have used freight as a lucrative side business, and this still carries on to this day. The rail freight business sector itself was created with the prime aim of fully moving freight from one point to another within British Rail. It's worth mentioning that there was another freight handling sector as well that's often forgotten about, and that was freight liners. Whilst this video is not going to go into the specific history of freight liners and look at how you the modelling of that, it's worth mentioning that freight liners was a separate business within British Rail until late 1988, when it was merged with the distribution arm of Railfreight to form Railfreight Distribution Limited. Freightliner only ever had, I believe, 2 locomotives to carry their own livery, which was large logo blue with yellow with blue cab sides and a small Freightliner intermodal. Other than that, they used their normal rail freight liveried locomotives. It was in reality, though, regarded as part of the business of rail freight, the Freightliner sector. Rail freight came into being with a vastly inherited fleet of locomotives. Within them, there were some locomotives that were specifically for freight. Now, this was the Class 20s, the Class 47/3s, and the Class 56s. Indeed, the Class 56 was the first class of locomotive to be built entirely for freight operations. And this was a key element of the introduction of the rail freight sector, was that previously locomotives had been designated mixed traffic, particularly on the West Coast Main Line. The first locomotive to carry the rail freight livery was a Class 58 58001, and also 56135, the very last Class 56 built, actually went straight into the rail freight livery at the time, which was a sort of brown grey colour with a large BR logo at one end, either right towards the end of the loco or at the middle. The locomotive would have small numbers, as you see here, underneath the driver's side window, and at the other side would, under the second man's window, the emblem Rail Freight. Rail Freight handled everything, from coal to cars, from pet food to aggregates, from nuclear flasks to thermal flasks. Yep, you name it, it would do it. At the time of its creation, of course, the largest commodity it carried was coal, although even then it was starting to go in ever-reducing numbers. It also handled steel traffic for the likes of British Steel, another major customer. And part of the Railfreight policy was the naming of locomotives after customers. For instance, the British Steel plants, they were named such as British Steel Teesside, British Steel Ravenscraig. Power stations and collieries were named as well. Egborough Power Station, Nottingley Colliery, and other customers such as the Ford plant at Halewood, Halewood Transmission, were recognised in naming ceremonies. Possibly inspired by Network South East in 1986 with their new identity, Railfreight asked the Roundel Design Group to come up with a new identity, which was first revealed in 1987 at the Ripple Lane Yard in London. Gone was the large logo brown-grey colour, and in its place was a brand new livery. It was triple grey, although I know that the doors look black here, with a grey band matching the depth of the windows on the locomotive, a silver grey, and there would be 5 different identities, each for a particular business sector. The one shown here is for metals and automotive. The other ones were coal, which also handled nuclear flask traffic, construction, which handled lots of aggregates and sand and was involved in the Channel Tunnel construction project, petroleum, which had wavy lines in a similar fashion to the metals symbols, but which also handled chemicals traffic, and distribution, which had 2 large diamonds coloured red. And this done likes of everything else, such as freightliner traffic, pet foods, water. The first locomotive to carry this livery was 37673, and it was joined shortly afterwards by former GWR 150 liveried 47079. They carried distribution and metals symbols respectively. Under this side here would have normally been a BR symbol, and under this window would have been the depot plaque, and would also have been the last 3 digits of the number on this side. The Railfreight business sector applied its thoughts and knowledge to such a great extent that it was the most profitable sector of British Rail, in fact. Both it and Intercity were the 2 major profit making centres of BR. It was broken up into 3 companies at privatisation: Transrail, Load Haul and Mainline. But recently a couple of rail freight companies have actually been putting a couple of their locomotives into retro liveries like this. GB Railfreight has a 66 in, I believe, the construction livery. So it's good to see that Railfreight is still hanging on. So when it comes to modelling rail freight, how do you go about doing it in the sectorisation era? Well, probably fair to say that rail freight was the most diverse of the 5 business sectors in terms of the locomotives that it actually operated, and in fact of the rolling stock it had. Rail freight had a large number of customers who had their own wagons, from British Steel to Tarmac. And it's also worth remembering, whilst we mention the customers, the Class 59s of Foster Yeoman and later also ARC as well. These were owned by the customers, and they carried that customer's livery, but they were maintained and crewed by British Rail on their behalf. The first thing to remember is that there were various different liveries applied to the Railfreight Mark 1 livery, which was the large logo livery. Thornaby and Tinsley were two depots that were always well renowned for their, shall we say, customisations of locos, even though they didn't always meet with the approval of the British Railways Board. And in fact, the most famous one, we're talking about a metals locomotive here, the most famous one has to be 37501 at Thornaby, which in 1987 was released in a light blue British Steel Corporation livery. The initial livery carried the BS symbol in white at one end, and it was in large logos and the large numerals. It was later altered to have the BSC logo at the other end and then a dark blue stripe along underneath it on the sole bar. But in early 1988 it was repainted again to its final version, which was the BSC logo in black under the driver's side window and the emblem Teesrail under the second man's window, and it was all light blue. Similar probably to the Codfather fish and chip shop you see there. The locomotive itself was carried in that livery until 1989, when it was repainted during a CEM light overhaul at Doncaster into metals livery. One has to say that could have been the actual original metals livery, would have been that colour there on 37501. Thornaby also, with the Railfreight large logo grey livery, applied large numerals like large logo blue to some of their locomotives. This didn't receive the heavy hand from the Railfreight board like what 37501 did, and it wasn't just applied to class 37s, some 47s as well. Also, when you're modelling locomotives, remember the revised Railfreight livery. This had a red band at the bottom, and it was originally applied to the class 58s from new, and class 20s got it as well, and some class 26s, just because the sole bar was there to decide to brighten it up. It was later applied to some 37s, and also 56s and 47s got it. I have to say though, it didn't really suit the class 47s or the 56s, which didn't have a sole bar, and therefore I must say it didn't really suit them. This livery did, however. So be aware that a Tinsley or Thornaby locomotive might have had an unauthorised customisation to it, and you are advised to actually do an internet search for that your particular locomotive that you wish to model, to see if there was a customisation at the time of that your layout is set in. Moving on, the metals livery and all the other subsector liveries of British Rail's rail freight sector didn't necessarily mean that that locomotive would always be working that sector's traffic. I have seen images of a metals liveried 37 hauling a China clay train, for instance, and I've also seen images of a construction train hauling a petroleum train. So there were occasions when one subsector's loco was used on another subsector's traffic. The lengths of trains will vary, of course, as well, from the very short ones, and this was particularly the case in the latter days of Speedlink, to the much more acceptable huge long coal trains. Do be aware as well that after 1987 some of the wagons would also, even if they were in the livery of an owner such as Shell, they would often carry the subsector logo as well. So just bear that in mind, that did sometimes happen. Railfreight had their emphasis on a very clean image as well, although it must be said that sometimes locomotives were begrimed, particularly those in the best traditions of coal engines. The Railfreight business sector as well was responsible for, as I say, the provision of locomotives after 1989 for the West Highland sleeper, and this is where another livery variation must be mentioned. I'm going to just show you this locomotive here. This is 47550 University of Dundee, and she is carrying mainline livery. It's basically the old intercity livery, no branding, and the stripes go right along to the end of the cab. Why I brought that up right now is that on the West Highland line, some of the 37/4s were repainted into that livery. The official reason given by Railfreight at the time was that with the locomotives often sometimes doing passenger turns or civil engineering turns, they didn't want their image to be associated with passengers. 37423, for instance, was actually repainted out of Railfreight metals into mainline livery in 1990. Interestingly, 37401 was repainted out of mainline into Railfreight distribution and did passenger turns on the West Highland line with the sleeper. Work that one out if you want. But some Railfreight locomotives did carry the mainline livery, and this was mainly the 37/4s, particularly those that were reallocated to the Teesside chemicals traffic, which was 37415 6920. Those that remained on the West Highland line, and also some Class 86s were also given the mainline livery. The Class 86 locomotives were originally on the West Coast Main Line a mixed traffic, but with the introduction of sectorisation and dedicated locomotives, the decision was made to introduce a new 86/6 category. This was basically 86/4s restricted to 75 miles per hour and had the electric train supply system removed or isolated. 86620 was the first such locomotive, and it carried the BR mainline livery. Other AC electrics would have carried at the time the intercity executive livery, but with just a BR arrow on it, BR logo on it, sorry, and no other branding. So just to bear that in mind, that on the West Highland line and on Teesside it was possible to have mainline liveried locomotives working freight. How clean or dirty should your wagons be as well? Well, I think with oil wagons in particular there would be a lot of staining on them. Locomotives were cleaned a lot more often than what wagons were, I have to say. So a good tip is to watch a video, I think it's by Richard Warren at Everard Junction. Anyway, whatever it is, I'll put the link up in the top right corner at some point during this video, and you'll be able to see a project to try and weather some wagons. I'll find that out. It'll either be David Watson or Richard down at Everard Junction, Richard Warren. Of course, just because it carried Railfreight livery didn't mean to say that it didn't work passenger turns as well. In fact, here on Clydebridge Station, as we have no freight, 47599 will actually be hauling passenger or parcels trains. So she will be getting some use, excuse me, she'll be getting some use down here, keeping herself busy. And it did actually occasionally happen that one sector's loco was borrowed to work another passenger sector loco's trains, even if it didn't have train heating. This one did have train heating, by the way, and I've seen a photo of her hauling a Trans-Pennine train from Liverpool to Newcastle. of course, we could flick that the other way around, and sometimes locomotives of the passenger sectors did freight trains. I've actually seen a photo of 47582 Network South East livery hauling a ballast train, and it was at Penmanoir on the North Wales coastline. I've also seen instances of where parcels locomotives did occasionally haul freight trains. So it can be flip reverse that. In fact, I've also seen a photo, I can show you there, 47708 Waverley. There's a book called British Rail at Work, ScotRail. It has this loco on the front cover, but in the book, in one of the sections, it shows you it hauling a freight train rather than a ScotRail express train. If you're modelling a rail freight depot or some sort of depot, worth remembering about diesel shunters as well. These diesel shunters, the Class 08s and Class 09s, would have almost certainly been in rail blue at the time, but some of them would have had triple grey livery, but very rarely did they have subsector symbols on them. There were also a few 08 shunters that were actually painted into the original Railfreight livery, and they had Railfreight branding on them, and they would have also had a red sole bar. The Railfreight depots and other parts also had later on signage altered, so it would have actually read Railfreight with a logo of the sponsoring sector. For instance, metals construction. Westbury, for instance, was a construction site. Thornaby would have been for metals. And one last thing, if you're modelling rail freight in the sectorisation era, and it's quite important, I stress this as well, the rail freight distribution livery that's been released recently on the retooled 2022 Bachmann locomotives, the 47s, had the rail freight distribution branding on it. That wasn't the original distribution livery. It would have just been like this, and it would have had the distribution symbols there, no other branding. That was the second version of that livery, particularly for the Channel Tunnel. One other subsector livery I forgot to mention to you was the general sector. And this was often applied at locations where there was more than one subsector operating. It was rarely applied to locomotives. 37673 was repainted originally as the trial version for this triple grey livery, and it actually carried a yellow rail freight plate on it. It gained its distribution symbols later on, prior to the official launch. 37106 did carry those brandings in service, and the only other two locos I know of that carried that in revenue earning service were 86627 and 50149. 37403 did carry those symbols, but that was not for revenue earning service. That was part of a photo shoot on the Forth Rail Bridge for the 1990 Rail Freight calendar. But that Rail Freight general symbol would have been seen at locations, not necessarily on locomotives where more than one subsector was operating. And of course there were the nuclear flask traffic, the brake vans. These would have, the ones from the Cumbrian coast which were repainted, they actually carried the coal subsector logo quite discreetly, as it was a coal subsector that was responsible for that. So I hope that's given you some advice on how to model the rail freight sector. Now there's one other last thing to mention to you. I mentioned about this stunning livery and what sort of influence Network South East had on Railfreight's decision to go for a new image. And that's quite appropriate because Network South East, which you can just see there, is going to be the subject of the next Sectors in Detail video, which will follow probably sometime in March 2022. And with Model Rail Scotland on the horizon at the time of filming of this, I hope that this video here gives you ideas on what to buy at Model Rail Scotland if you want to model freight trains in the sectorisation period, and also if you're wanting to get extra stuff. There's videos that you'll have got links to in the top right corner of the screen throughout this video, and I'll maybe put a couple down in the description below so you can go and enjoy these videos. Lastly, if you're going to be visiting Model Rail Scotland on Saturday the 26th of February, I look forward to seeing you there because I'll be attending as well. In the meantime, all that remains for me to do is to say thank you very much indeed for watching. I hope this has helped, and will you please take care of yourselves and enjoy your layouts. We'll see you soon. Goodbye for now.